So PAS defines retrofit at scale with these words. Large-scale retrofit programs are likely to become more common and are often driven by the objective of alleviating fuel poverty, as well as improving energy efficiency and reducing emissions. Note the phrase likely to become more common. This is an understatement, of course. If national emissions targets are to be met, especially across the social housing sector, then retrofit at scale isn't just likely, it's obviously inevitable. In the guidance for SHDF, the latest guidance, it's saying that retrofit at scale is going to include the following teams as with a project plan to begin with. And you have very first top of the list is setting up a project team as part of the project setup. We see LivGreen being in on the ground floor as part of the initial project setup as being essential, especially if you're going to make best use of the brief timescale that you're afforded under waves 2.1 and 2.2 of SHDF at the moment, which is a 2-year program. Wave 3, we've been told, is going to be a 3-year program, which feels like a more realistic approach to a timescale. And then the other things in a plan should be listed out would be, as shown on the screen, procurement activity, an early tenant engagement idea of activities, project design and coordination, especially. And then obviously coming straight off the back of that is the contractors program, with handover and monitoring activities being inevitable as well under PAS, of course. This for us normally yields a nice tabulated set of results where we can put in front of the client the measures that we might be proposing for a selection of houses. We do this on a project by project basis, taking batches of up to 30 houses on any given scheme. So for SHDF, if we're working on a full application, that's normally a minimum of 100 buildings. And we set out things here showing the basic increment in energy performance, the reduction of heat demand, and the cost at the bottom. This is a very, I've edited this one. This is what it sort of looks like, but it's got more detail when we do it, depending, to really help people decide on a line-by-line basis about costings, and also add in remediation works that will be necessary.
So at the beginning, you might have your SHDF documentation. You're scrabbling around. You've got a deadline to get it in. You're filling in spreadsheets. You're not sure where the data is coming from, loads of different data sources, but eventually you get it together and you get your bid in, and you have a big sigh of relief. What happens next is you sit back for a couple of weeks, usually longer because they never tell you in times with their deadlines, but then you win the funding. And now you're on to starting to deliver your program. Now, when you look back at your documentation, you can't remember where you got all the information from. So essentially, often you have to start again, and you start building your program, the individual properties, and working out what you need to do to those properties. You use that to then direct surveys. Now, the surveys come back different to what's in your spreadsheets or your other tools, and they're not integrated in what those surveys are involved in. So you've now got another version of the truth. But eventually you do get through, probably with little hair left, to the end of the program. Maybe not achieving as much as you wanted because of different focuses on trying to do a lot of the program management rather than the delivery. And you get to the reporting, and now you're having to look at all these different documents again to see which was your starting point, what was your real baseline, and what have you actually done, and what's your end point. And again, that might end up being a lot of data work. So we're offering an integrated data flow. So it's sort of one version of the truth. So the portfolio there holds those data versions. And as you're doing continuous data updates and using your Surveyor Pro to do your surveys, it's continuing to inform things. And you've got the history there as well. The other really key benefit of this is when you get to the end, it's not down tools, because there's expected to be another, possibly a different party in government before the end of the year. And they will no doubt come with different funding opportunities, slight tweaks on things, or major changes. Now, if your data is kept up to date, then, and using our tool, you'll be in great shape to capture the next round of funding with little more than a press of a button, at least get the data out. You'll still have to write all the documents yourself and the funding bit.
So we mentioned SHDF as well. Particularly in Wave 2.1, there was a requirement. There was an option for digitalization, which a number of landlords took advantage of. It was, as I mentioned, an optional support and only kind of limited per bid. But sensors and other monitoring technologies were included in that. There were also, I think, probably Parity may have been part of that as well, the digitalization being available for their platform as well. But a key objective under Wave 2.1 was that households shouldn't be pushed into further fuel poverty. So energy bills shouldn't increase as a result of that retrofit work. So looking at post-monitoring evaluation, if we're able to understand the differences between energy use pre and post retrofit, that provides a really good tool for understanding how that's impacted residents directly and gives insight into this area. Another area or another kind of funding program that is pushing monitoring is in Wales and the Optimised Retrofit Programme. So for any property that has received or will be receiving works under the Optimised Retrofit Programme, there are requirements for monitoring now. So both pre and post retrofit for 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks. Pre retrofit, they require both energy and internal condition monitoring to get that kind of baseline and understand the impact of the retrofit. And then post retrofit, there's now a requirement for 5 years of monitoring to ensure that the property is performing as expected. Now, the minimum requirements are the energy and the internal condition monitoring. There's another number of other areas to monitor, looking at kind of performance of things like heating systems, looking at demand for energy in other areas, so things like EVs, that kind of thing. So it's quite an extensive program in terms of demands for data and how we're going to scale up data for retrofit. We see it kind of as leading the way in doing this, but also a test bed for understanding how effective that can be in terms of ensuring retrofit is delivering the intended outcomes that it is expected to deliver. So that's an area that's growing at the moment and may provide some insight for scaling up across the whole of the UK.
If we have good quality EPC data and are confident that the properties we've earmarked for retrofit will be below level C, what would your recommended approach be to validate this in a feasibility study?
Yeah, I mean, EPC data gives you some measure of comfort, but many social properties won't have EPC data. So in theory, that's a nice idea, but it'll still be quite patchy generally in our experience. And it's obviously out of date and done for different reasons at different times. So a retrofit assessment EPR is a very specific thing that's taking a deeper dive into the look of particular properties. Some EPC surveys are conducted as almost as drive-bys. So if that EPC data is the data that's being referred to, it's not as robust as you think. If it's retrofit assessment data, then that's a whole different kettle of fish.
Yeah, I kind of echo that. We were involved in a project looking at EPC data, and I think it was something like 30 properties, which all they were all built at the same time, all part of the same project. Very similar properties, slightly different orientation, things like that, but basically they were the same property, just replicated. And we saw a huge kind of variation in the heat loss insight for those properties. Sort of 25% in each direction, a spread of how well those properties were performing. So as Andy says, EPCs go some way to understanding how what property is doing and how it should perform, but there's a whole host of other factors to take into account. And yeah, installing our sensors is one way of doing that, to understand how well they're kind of performing thermally. But again, there's different approaches.
I also, just to chip in, I asked Chris Newman this question once when he and I spoke and I was first getting to know about parity, and he said EPC data is the last tranche of data that we normally approach, having gone through our own stock analysis. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, there's always other data down the back of the safe or in asset management systems or in people's heads, and the sort of the EPC data is there as the last resort. But yeah, there's always practical considerations which you're not going to get unless you know the stock, either by having somebody who knows it, knows that block of flats and the issues around it, or going there and having a retrofit coordinator do a survey and working out that the loft is just totally full and you can't get up there, and other external constraints for external wall or anything like that. You're never going to get round unless you visit the property, really.